Duncan MacLeod crawled through the snow tunnel on his hands and knees, the curved wooden arch above him groaning under tons of accumulated weight, but holding firm. Outside, the blizzard of 1866 howled with winds that had already killed 3 men in the valley, but inside his cabin at the tunnel's end, the temperature held steady at 65 degrees without burning excessive firewood. Before we explore how Duncan's impossible tunnel system saved his life, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if winter survival stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable. The year was 1865, and the Montana Territory was experiencing what homesteaders would later call the golden years of settlement. The land was opening up, territorial conflicts had decreased in certain regions, and men willing to work hard could claim parcels that offered genuine opportunity. Duncan MacLeod had arrived in the territory 8 winters earlier, a Scottish immigrant from the Highlands who had learned to survive in conditions that drove softer men back to civilization. He was 31 years old, competent with an axe and rifle, and possessed the kind of stubborn practicality that defined successful frontiersmen. He had claimed land near the Flathead Lake region, in a valley that provided access to timber, water, and reasonable protection from the worst weather. His cabin was solid, built in the traditional style, with horizontally stacked logs, chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace that drew well, and a single door facing south to catch maximum sunlight during short winter days. Duncan's nearest neighbor was Callum Fraser, an Irish trapper who had come west 5 years earlier and claimed adjacent land less than a mile through the timber. Callum was 43, cheerful despite the hardships, and possessed an infectious optimism that made him popular among the scattered community of homesteaders and trappers in the region. The 2 men had formed a partnership of sorts, helping each other with major projects, sharing news and supplies, and providing the kind of companionship that made frontier isolation bearable. They were not close friends in the deep sense, but they were reliable neighbors, and on the frontier that mattered more than sentiment. Both men had built their cabins using methods that were standard throughout the territory. Logs were cut to length, notched at the corners using simple saddle joints, and stacked to a height of about 7 feet before roof poles were laid across. The chinking between logs was packed with whatever material was available, usually a mixture of mud, moss, and dried grass. Doors were heavy, plank affairs hung on iron hinges if a man could afford them, or leather straps if he could not. Windows were rare, and when they existed, they were covered with oiled paper or scraped hide that admitted light while keeping out wind. The roofs were pole frames covered with bark and sod, sloped to shed rain and snow. These structures kept a man alive through winter, which was their primary purpose, and asking more of them seemed unnecessary. The autumn of 1865 had been productive for both men. Duncan had put up adequate firewood, smoked meat from a successful elk hunt, and stored root vegetables in a small dugout cellar he had excavated beneath his cabin floor. Callum had done similarly, and both men faced the approaching winter with the confidence of experience. They had survived previous winters without incident. They understood the rhythms of cold weather survival. They knew to stay inside during storms, to ration firewood carefully, to avoid unnecessary risks when temperatures dropped dangerously low. The community of homesteaders scattered through the valley numbered perhaps 20 individuals, including a few families, and they all shared similar preparations and similar confidence. Winter was harsh, but it was predictable, and men who followed established practices generally survived to see spring. Early December of 1865 brought weather that defied all previous experience in the valley. The first snow had fallen in late October, which was normal, and through November the accumulation had been steady but manageable. Then, on December 7th, the sky darkened with a peculiar yellow-gray color that old-timers recognized as a warning. The storm arrived that night with wind speeds that made the cabin walls shudder and snow that fell so thick it created complete whiteout conditions by morning. Duncan woke to find his door blocked by a drift that had piled 4 feet high against the south side of his cabin. He spent an hour digging himself out, only to watch the entrance fill again within 30 minutes as the wind continued driving snow horizontally across the landscape. The storm lasted 3 full days without pause. Duncan remained inside, venturing out only twice to bring in firewood from the covered pile he had stacked against his cabin's west wall. Each trip outside was brutal. The wind cut through his heaviest coat, and the cold was profound enough that exposed skin began to freeze within seconds. He burned through firewood at an alarming rate, feeding his fireplace constantly to maintain survivable interior temperatures. By the third day, he had consumed nearly a third of his winter supply, but he was alive and reasonably comfortable. The storm finally broke on the morning of December 10th, leaving the valley buried under 6 feet of fresh snow on top of the existing accumulation. Duncan spent that morning digging paths and checking his supplies. Around midday, he decided to check on Callum. The mile-long trek through chest-deep snow took over 2 hours, exhausting work that left him sweating despite the cold. When he reached Callum's cabin, he found the door still barricaded by snow, which seemed promising. He called out but received no answer. He began digging at the entrance, and after 20 minutes of work, he got the door open. The cabin was empty. Confusion turned to dread as Duncan searched the area, following a barely visible depression in the snow that might have been tracks. He found Callum 50 yards from his cabin, half buried in a drift, frozen solid. The story became clear from the evidence. Callum had run out of firewood inside his cabin on the second day of the storm. He had gone outside to reach his woodpile, which was located about 30 yards from his door. He had successfully gathered an armload of wood, but on his return trip, the wind and snow had disoriented him. He had become lost in the whiteout, unable to find his cabin despite being within yards of it. At some point, he had dropped the firewood and tried to continue searching. The cold had killed him quickly. When Duncan finally got Callum's door open from inside, he discovered the interior was actually warmer than outside because the snow accumulation had insulated the structure, but Callum had frozen to death trying to get back to that warmth. Duncan waited 4 days for the snow to settle enough that he could dig a proper grave. The ground was frozen too hard for burial, so he wrapped Callum's body in canvas and stored it in a snow bank until spring thaw would allow proper interment. He marked the location with a tall pole so he could find it again when the time came. The work was mechanical, his mind elsewhere, replaying the circumstances of Callum's death with obsessive detail. 50 yards. Callum had died 50 yards from safety, with warmth and shelter within reach, killed not by the storm itself, but by his inability to access protection that existed mere steps away. Duncan returned to his own cabin and spent the next week in a state that worried him. He could not sleep properly. He lay awake at night listening to wind, imagining himself outside in whiteout conditions, disoriented, freezing, unable to find a door that was right in front of him. The traditional cabin design suddenly seemed insane to him. A single point of entry exposed directly to whatever weather arrived, offering no protection during the act of entering or leaving. Opening the door meant exposing the entire interior to exterior conditions. A man who needed to go outside during a storm had no choice but to face the full violence of the weather immediately upon crossing the threshold. During one sleepless night, a memory surfaced from Duncan's childhood in the Scottish Highlands. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, sitting by the fire in his family's stone cottage, listening to his father Hamish tell stories. Hamish MacLeod had worked on fishing boats in his youth and had traveled to Norway on several occasions. He told young Duncan about the Sami people who lived in the far north, how they built homes partially underground with entrance tunnels that kept out wind and cold. Hamish had described these tunnels with fascination, explaining how a person would crawl through a passage to reach the living space, and how this design meant the interior stayed warm even in the most brutal weather because the cold air never reached the main room directly. Duncan had forgotten that conversation for over 2 decades. Now it returned with perfect clarity, and he found himself sketching designs by firelight. What if a cabin had a secondary entrance, a passage through the snow itself that created a buffer between outside and inside? What if the door did not open directly to the exterior, but to a tunnel that provided graduated temperature transition? The concept seemed simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. He drew crude diagrams, trying to work out dimensions and angles, questioning why no one in the territory built this way. When Angus Brennan and Seamus O'Donnell visited in late December to check on him and discuss Callum's death, Duncan mentioned the tunnel idea. Angus stared at him for a long moment before declaring it the grief madness talking. Seamus was gentler but equally dismissive, suggesting Duncan needed rest and time to recover from the shock of losing his neighbor. Neither man took the concept seriously. Duncan did not argue with them. He simply continued sketching. Spring arrived late in 1866, and when the snow finally melted enough to allow movement, Duncan buried Callum on a hillside overlooking the valley. He spoke no words over the grave, simply piled stones to mark it, and returned to his cabin with renewed determination. The winter had clarified something essential in his mind. Traditional cabin design was adequate for normal winters, but lethal during extreme conditions. If he intended to survive another season like the previous one, he needed to build differently. Throughout the spring and summer, Duncan became obsessed with a single engineering problem: how to create a tunnel entrance that would not collapse under snow weight. He understood instinctively that a simple square or rectangular opening would fail. Snow was heavy, and tons of accumulated weight would crush any unsupported span. He needed a shape that distributed force efficiently, and his mind kept returning to the arches he had seen in stone bridges and mineshaft entrances during his youth in Scotland. In early June, Duncan traveled to a copper mine operation 30 miles south of his land. He told the foreman he was interested in timber work and spent 2 days studying how the miners reinforced their tunnels. The mine shafts used curved wooden supports, thick timbers bent or shaped into semicircular arches that held back thousands of pounds of earth and rock. The foreman explained the principle in simple terms. An arch transfers weight outward and downward along its curve rather than straight down through a single point. The shape itself provides strength that straight timbers cannot match. Duncan returned to his cabin and began searching for the right wood. He needed a naturally curved piece, something strong enough to bear immense weight but shapeable enough to work with basic tools. He spent 2 weeks walking through forests, examining trees, rejecting dozens before he found what he needed. A large pine tree had grown on a slope, and its lower trunk had curved naturally before straightening as it reached for sunlight. Duncan felled the tree, cut a 10-foot section that included the curve, and hauled it back to his cabin using a borrowed mule. The work of shaping the arch consumed most of July. Duncan stripped the bark completely, using a draw knife to smooth the wood and create a consistent thickness. He shaped the curve into a semicircle with a diameter of approximately 5 feet, large enough for a man to crawl through comfortably, but small enough to maintain structural integrity. He created a flat base on each end where the arch would rest against the ground and cabin wall. The finished piece weighed nearly 80 pounds, dense pine that would not rot quickly and possessed the strength to support tremendous weight. Angus Brennan stopped by in early August and found Duncan testing the arch by piling stones on top of it. Angus watched for a moment before shaking his head and declaring that MacLeod was building a monument to foolishness. Duncan ignored him and continued his tests. The arch held firm under every load he applied. Late August brought the precise conditions Duncan needed for installation work. The ground was dry enough to dig but not yet frozen, and he had several weeks before the first snows would arrive. He began by studying his cabin's north wall, the side that faced prevailing winter winds and received the deepest snow accumulation during storms. This was where the tunnel entrance needed to be positioned, both to take advantage of natural drifting and to protect the opening from wind that might fill it faster than he could maintain it. Duncan measured carefully before cutting into his cabin wall. He marked a spot 3 feet above ground level, high enough to stay above the initial snow base, but low enough that deep accumulation would still bury it completely. Using a saw and axe, he cut through the logs to create an opening that matched his arch diameter. The work took 2 full days because he needed to preserve the structural integrity of the wall while removing a significant section. He reinforced the opening's interior edges with additional timber, creating a frame that would support the weight above it. The interior hatch required equal attention. Duncan built a thick wooden door that would seal the tunnel opening from inside the cabin. He mounted it on iron hinges salvaged from a broken wagon he had purchased from a passing freight hauler the previous spring. The door opened inward, which meant snow pressure from outside would actually help seal it rather than force it open. He added a simple wooden bar lock that would secure the door from the interior, and he insulated the edges with strips of wool blanket to prevent drafts. Outside, Duncan dug a foundation trench for the arch. He excavated 2 feet deep in a semicircular pattern that matched the arch's curve, knowing that the base needed to sit below the frost line to prevent shifting during freeze-thaw cycles. He positioned the curved wooden arch so its top aligned with the new opening in his cabin wall and its base sat firmly in the trench. The arch created a perfect semicircular frame, 5 feet in diameter, that would serve as the tunnel's entrance portal. Anchoring the arch proved to be the most critical step. Duncan drove wooden stakes into the trench bottom and lashed the arch base to them using rawhide strips that would tighten as they dried. He then backfilled the trench with rocks and packed earth, creating a foundation that locked the arch in place. Where the arch met the cabin wall, he drilled holes through both the arch timber and the cabin logs, then drove iron pins through to connect them rigidly. The result was a structure that could not shift or separate from the cabin under any circumstances. To test the installation, Duncan gathered every heavy object he owned and piled them on top of the arch. Stones, firewood, tools, and sacks of grain created a load of several hundred pounds. He left the weight in place for 3 days. The arch did not move, crack, or show any sign of weakness. The structure was ready for winter. November of 1866 arrived with temperatures that dropped faster than normal and snow that began accumulating in the first week of the month. Duncan watched the storms with anticipation rather than dread. Each snowfall added depth to the pack surrounding his cabin, and he needed at least 4 feet of accumulation before he could begin excavating his tunnel. Light snow would not provide adequate insulation or structural integrity. He needed dense, settled snow that would pack firm and hold its shape when carved. By mid-November, the snow had reached the depth he required. Duncan prepared his tools, sharpening his shovel blade and gathering canvas sacks to remove excavated snow without scattering it wastefully. He planned to use the removed snow to reinforce the tunnel walls by packing it into any gaps or weak points he discovered during digging. Nothing would be wasted in this process. He began excavation from inside his cabin, opening the interior hatch and starting to dig outward through the snow that had accumulated against his north wall. The curved wooden arch served as his starting framework, and he used it as a template for the tunnel's dimensions. He carved carefully, maintaining the 5-foot diameter throughout, creating a tube through the snowpack that matched the arch's semicircular shape. The work was slow and methodical. He could only dig for short periods before needing to back into the cabin to warm himself and rest his muscles. The excavation technique required precision. Duncan discovered that he needed to angle the tunnel slightly upward as it extended away from the cabin. A level tunnel would allow cold air to pool at the cabin entrance, defeating the purpose of the design. By creating a gentle upward slope of approximately 10 degrees, he ensured that cold air would sink toward the exterior entrance, while warmer air would naturally rise toward the cabin end. The physics were simple, but the execution demanded constant attention to angle and direction. After clearing the first 10 feet of tunnel, Duncan installed his first interior support arch. He had prepared several smaller curved wooden pieces during the summer, each designed to span the tunnel diameter and provide reinforcement against collapse. He positioned the support arch approximately 6 feet from the cabin wall, wedging it firmly into the packed snow walls and securing its base by packing additional snow around it until it froze solid. The support prevented any sagging or deformation of the tunnel ceiling. He continued excavating outward, installing additional support arches every 6 feet along the tunnel's length. Each support required careful positioning and packing, but once frozen in place, they created a remarkably rigid structure. After 3 days of steady work, Duncan broke through to open air 20 feet from his cabin wall. The exterior entrance emerged in a location that would remain accessible even during heavy storms because it was positioned far enough from the cabin to avoid the deepest drifting patterns he had observed during previous winters. Angus Brennan arrived at Duncan's cabin in late November, ostensibly to borrow an axe, but clearly curious about the tunnel project he had heard discussed among other homesteaders. Duncan invited him to examine the completed system, and Angus crawled through the entire length, emerging at the exterior entrance before walking back around to the cabin's main door. His expression when he came inside was a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "That," Angus declared, brushing snow from his coat, "is the stupidest waste of effort I have ever witnessed in 8 years on this frontier." He explained his reasoning with the confidence of experience. The tunnel would collapse under heavy snow, trapping Duncan inside, or crushing him if he happened to be crawling through during a storm. Even if it somehow held, the enclosed space would fill with carbon dioxide from Duncan's breathing and kill him just as surely as freezing. And even if both those concerns proved wrong, the entire concept was unnecessary because any man with sense simply kept his woodpile inside his cabin or built a covered passage above ground. Duncan listened without argument, then explained his reasoning. The tunnel used the snow's own weight to create insulation rather than fighting against it. The curved arch design distributed force efficiently, making collapse unlikely unless he had miscalculated drastically. The tunnel's upward angle and substantial length meant fresh air would circulate adequately, and he could always leave both ends open during non-storm periods to ensure ventilation. As for keeping firewood inside, Duncan's cabin was barely large enough for his living space, and storing an entire winter's supply of wood indoors was impractical for a man living alone. Angus remained unconvinced. He pointed out that Duncan had spent 3 months building something that might be used a handful of times during winter, whereas that same effort could have been spent building a larger cabin with interior wood storage. The math simply did not work in the tunnel's favor. Seamus O'Donnell visited 2 days later and echoed Angus's skepticism, though with gentler language. He worried that Duncan was still affected by Callum's death, that grief was driving him to extreme solutions for problems that did not require such complexity. A man who kept adequate supplies inside and simply refused to go outside during storms would survive just fine. Callum's death was tragic but avoidable through basic caution, not elaborate engineering. Duncan did not argue with either man. Instead, he conducted private tests that satisfied his own questions. He measured interior cabin temperature under different conditions, with the main door opened directly to outside air, with the tunnel entrance opened but the interior hatch closed, and with both the tunnel system in use and the interior hatch opened. The results were definitive. Using the tunnel system maintained cabin temperature approximately 15 degrees warmer than direct door opening, a difference that translated directly into firewood conservation and survival margin during extended storms. Late January of 1866 brought weather that would be recorded in territorial records as the worst winter storm of the decade. The sky had shown warning signs for 2 days prior, with temperatures dropping steadily and clouds building from the northwest in layers that suggested massive atmospheric disturbance. On January 23rd, the storm arrived with a ferocity that exceeded even the deadly December blizzard of the previous year that had killed Callum Fraser. The wind began howling before dawn, reaching speeds that Duncan estimated at 60 or 70 miles per hour based on how the gusts made his cabin walls creak and shift. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to 0 within the first hour. Duncan stood at his small window and watched the world disappear into white chaos. By mid-morning, snow was accumulating at a rate he had never witnessed, at least 2 feet every 12 hours, piling up in drifts that reshaped the landscape into unfamiliar contours. Duncan's cabin was buried completely by the end of the first day. The snow reached above his roofline on the north side, and the only reason he knew day from night was the faint light that penetrated through his window on the south wall. He opened his interior tunnel hatch and crawled through to check the exterior entrance. The opening was already half filled with drifting snow, but he cleared it with his shovel and retreated back inside. The tunnel system was performing exactly as he had designed it to perform. Over the next 5 days, the storm continued without meaningful pause. Duncan established a routine. Every 6 hours, he crawled through the tunnel to clear the exterior entrance and to retrieve firewood from the supply he had stacked just outside the opening specifically for this purpose. Each trip took approximately 10 minutes. He would crawl through the tunnel, shovel snow away from the entrance, grab an armload of wood, and return to the cabin. The tunnel temperature remained around 30 degrees, cold but not dangerously so, and the exertion of crawling kept his blood moving. Inside the cabin, he maintained a steady fire that kept the interior at 65 degrees, comfortable enough that he wore only a single wool shirt rather than his heavy winter coat. On the 4th day of the storm, Duncan heard gunshots in the distance, 3 sharp cracks that carried through the wind despite the muffling effect of heavy snow. Distress signals. Someone was in trouble, probably trapped or injured. Duncan knew better than to attempt a rescue. Visibility was still absolute zero, and venturing more than a few yards from his tunnel entrance would mean certain death from disorientation and exposure. He listened for more shots, but heard nothing further. The storm finally broke on the morning of January 31st, 8 full days after it had begun. Duncan crawled through his tunnel and emerged into brilliant sunshine and air so cold it burned his lungs. The valley had been transformed into an unrecognizable landscape of massive drifts and wind-sculpted formations. Duncan spent the first morning after the storm digging himself out and establishing paths around his cabin. The snow had accumulated to depths that varied wildly depending on wind patterns, with some areas showing 8 feet of accumulation while others had been scoured nearly down to ground level. His tunnel entrance had filled completely with drift snow, but the curved wooden arch had held perfectly, and he was able to re-excavate the passage within 2 hours of steady work. By midday, he decided to check on his neighbors. The trek to Angus Brennan's cabin took 4 hours through snow that was chest-deep in most places and required frequent stops to rest. When he finally reached Angus's homestead, he found the older man exhausted but alive. Angus's cabin had survived structurally, but he had burned through his entire winter firewood supply during the 8-day storm. He had been forced to feed his fire constantly to prevent freezing, and now faced the prospect of cutting and hauling firewood through deep snow for the remainder of winter. He looked at Duncan with an expression that contained no mockery, only grim acknowledgment. The next day, Duncan made the longer journey to check on other homesteaders scattered through the valley. He discovered that 3 men had died during the storm. 2 had frozen to death after their cabins had lost heat due to inadequate firewood supplies. The 3rd had died from smoke inhalation when his chimney became blocked by snow accumulation and he had not realized it in time. The man's wife had survived only because she had smelled the smoke building and managed to extinguish the fire before the fumes killed her as well. Finnegan Ross, an Irish homesteader who lived 3 miles west of Duncan, had experienced the most dramatic failure. His cabin had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow on the 4th day of the storm. The roof had caved in on one side, destroying his sleeping area and most of his supplies. Finnegan and his wife had survived by huddling in the remaining intact corner of the structure, burning furniture to stay warm after their firewood became inaccessible under debris. They had emerged from the storm traumatized and facing complete loss of their homestead. When Duncan reached the Ross cabin and saw the destruction, Finnegan asked him directly how he had survived in such good condition. Duncan explained the tunnel system, describing how it had allowed him to access firewood safely throughout the storm while maintaining cabin heat with minimal fuel consumption. Finnegan listened with intense focus, asking detailed questions about the arch construction, tunnel dimensions, and excavation process. Within 3 days, word had spread through the surviving homesteader community. Duncan's tunnel system had allowed him to weather the worst storm in territorial memory while using less firewood than anyone else and maintaining complete safety. Angus Brennan, when asked by others what he thought of MacLeod's design now, simply said that results spoke louder than his previous opinions. The mockery had ended, replaced by genuine interest in understanding how the system worked. Spring of 1866 brought a slow thaw and the difficult work of rebuilding for those whose cabins had failed during the blizzard of '66. Finnegan Ross began reconstruction in April, and Duncan spent several days helping him design and install a tunnel system based on the principles that had saved Duncan's life. Finnegan's version used a stone arch rather than curved wood, built from flat rocks mortared together, creating a permanent entrance that would last indefinitely. The technique worked equally well, and by the following November, Finnegan had a functional tunnel system ready for winter. Word of the tunnel design spread through informal networks that connected scattered homesteaders across the Montana Territory. By the winter of 1867, 4 additional families had built variations of the system. Some created L-shaped tunnels that provided even better wind protection. Others experimented with dual entrances that allowed through passage without entering the cabin itself, useful for accessing livestock shelters or secondary storage buildings. The core principle remained constant: use snow depth as insulation rather than fighting it, and create buffer zones that prevented direct exposure between interior warmth and exterior cold. Duncan continued his homesteading work through the late 1860s, improving his land and building a modest prosperity through careful management, and hard winters survived. In 1871, he traveled back to Scotland and returned with Margaret, a woman from his home village, whom he had courted before emigrating. They married and established a life together in the Montana cabin that had become famous in local circles as the structure that could not be defeated by weather. By 1878, the Montana Territory was changing. Railroads were arriving, bringing larger numbers of settlers and transforming the isolated frontier into something more resembling civilization. Duncan and Margaret decided to move west to Oregon Territory, where land was available for farming rather than just subsistence homesteading. They sold their Montana property to a young couple from Minnesota and left behind the cabin with its distinctive curved wooden arch still mounted on the north wall. Duncan spent his remaining years farming in Oregon's Willamette Valley, a landscape so different from Montana that it might as well have been another country. He and Margaret raised 3 children, who grew up knowing their father as a quiet man who worked hard and spoke little about his past. When Duncan died in 1893 at the age of 63, his family buried him in a cemetery outside Salem. His children knew he had once lived in Montana, but they never learned about the tunnel system or the winter that had made their father's survival technique spread across the northern territories. In Montana, the cabin Duncan had built still stood decades later, weathered but solid. The curved wooden arch remained visible each spring when snow melted, a piece of engineering that had solved a problem most men never recognized existed. Settlers moving through the region occasionally used the abandoned structure, and some noticed the unusual entrance and wondered what purpose it had served, never knowing it represented the difference between death and survival.